All right, we're continuing our study in 1 Peter, and today Peter's changing his focus to some extent. You know, he has been pointing out the greatness of salvation. A lot of what we've been talking about so far is Peter was reviewing. You know, it's not really a secret or anything hidden from anyone, but this great salvation. And he mentioned in several ways how over time, as things were being revealed, you know, through the Old Testament, that the prophets, as they mentioned these things, they didn't completely understand what they were saying or the significance of that and the meaning of it. But over time it kind of built up. But how privileged New Testament Christians are, where we can understand the story and appreciate it. And even angels, he mentioned, long to look into things that were being said, mysteries that were over time being revealed. So Christians really do have a special relationship with God. And it mentioned in here how some things that Peter described Christians as, and quite a compliment when you think of it. Things such as a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, that we were God's own people. You know, we all love belonging to something, and to be appreciated, to be loved, to be respected. And that's how God looks at his people. And that's really something. That's quite a compliment. And we also talked about how Christ was the chief cornerstone, and we as Christians are living stones, part of that building, interconnected, and for the purpose of not only obeying and worshiping and magnifying God, but also helping one another in our relationship to God. But today, Peter's changing his focus just a little bit. Rather than some of these general things, he's really going to get down to some specific things. And we might look at it as being, maybe this is part of a survival handbook as far as Christians goes, or when we buy something new, we always have a manual, a procedure manual, or an instruction manual on how to use something. Whether or not we use it or not, it's something different. But most things come with it. So we're shifting our focus. And we can remember on Pentecost, Peter preached that great sermon. So he was telling people how to be saved. Now what he's looking at is how to stay saved. And if that wasn't necessary, then he's just wasting his time. But we know how to stay saved is something that is important. So if the Holy Spirit, through Peter, is telling all these things on how to do something, it only makes sense that if we don't do something, the opposite's going to happen. So basically, he's saying here, if we don't do these things, then we're in jeopardy of falling away. So it's something that oftentimes is not easy to do. Sometimes it even makes life harder. But still, it's the right thing to do. And in the long term, in the end, in God's eyes, it's better for us. So again, Peter is writing to these first century Christians who primarily have a Jewish background, and they're in a pretty tough situation. They're in the area of modern day Turkey. They're under Roman rule. So just that fact, you know, the Romans weren't pro-Christian. They looked at them as just kind of a pain, something that's in the way, something that's probably going to cause trouble, because, you know, they usually looked at them as a derivative of Jews, and Jews were they're just a thorn in the side all the time. So Christians probably had a strike against them to begin with. So Peter knew that these Jewish Christians were facing some hard times and some animosity from the Roman government. But he also knew, and we'll get into it more in 2 Peter, that these Jewish Christians were either currently getting some flack from Jews who were trying to, Judaizing teachers trying to convince them that no, you need to combine the two, or if they weren't at the time, they soon will be. And Peter knows that these folks, they need to be prepared. They need to know what's coming up. They need to know how to react because it makes a difference. And they don't have time for trial and error. You know, some things we can do that. We try something. If it doesn't work, I'll try something else. But when it comes to their lives here, and a lot of times their lives are on the line, they didn't have time and that opportunity to try something and go in a different direction. They need to know what they needed to do, and that's what Peter is about to tell them. And of course, Peter wasn't, when it comes to the thought of maybe looking at a survival manual of sorts, Peter wasn't the only one who told things. You know, Paul spent a lot of time. You can think of his letters to the different churches, how he was instructing them how to live, how to worship, the interactions with themselves and other people. So let's, again, Peter's getting fairly specific in some things here as opposed to some of the things he said so far. So let's look at some of these things. So we're in 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 13. Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. So Peter's being pretty straightforward here. He's saying you need to submit to, or you need to obey those who are in authority. Of course, Paul preached or wrote in the 13th chapter of Romans something that's essentially the same, the relationship of Christians to the government. So he's being pretty straightforward here. But he mentions something here. This isn't just a recommendation, but something that the Lord God is paying attention to. For he submit yourselves for the Lord's sake. So God is paying attention to this. You know, it's not just a casual thought or an opinion. It's something that God really is paying attention to. And of course, this premise is always modified by the thought of what government is telling us to do. We need to compare it to what God has told us to do. Because when they're in conflict, we have to make a decision, but we always, of course, have to go with what God says. And Peter said the same thing way back in Acts chapter 5, verse 29. We must obey God rather than man. So this isn't anything new, this relationship and this decision tree that you have to make sometimes. But sometimes, you know, it may be a little hard to stomach some of the things that the government is telling us or other authorities. But when you think of it, being in an environment where there's a government in force is far better than if you're in an environment where there's just anarchy. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation. Maybe the closest thing we can relate to it might be if you've ever taught some Bible classes or had a birthday party with little kids just running everywhere crazy. I mean, that's anarchy. That's just chaos. It's just, you know, things are out of control. We don't want to live like that, and it's really difficult to live that way. I think all of us feel better when we know what's expected of us. If we know what our responsibilities are, if we know that when we do something, what'll happen, if we don't do something, what'll happen, rather than it being different all the time and just don't really know, you know, what's going on. That's insecurity like that is pretty miserable. And I think for the most part, most societies recognize certain things as being good or bad, even if they're an evil country. You know, most societies look at murder and stealing as something that's bad, and they won't tolerate it because they want to continue to exist themselves. So they're not going to put up with things that just tear down their society or civilization. So they look poorly on things such as murder and stealing. But when you think of it in an environment where we have structure, which our leaders provide for us, it's much easier for us to relate to other people and try to teach them. Where if we never know what's going to happen when we say something, or again, the situation of being in chaos or anarchy, it'd be really hard to teach others about Christ. When you don't have any structure, you don't know what's going to happen, if you don't even know if you're going to see that person again because of things that might come up. If things are constantly changing, it's really hard to relate and teach others. Also, one of the major roles of government is to punish the evildoers, at least those that they consider to be evil in their society, in their culture. The role is to enforce the laws, but it's also, as it's mentioned here, to praise those who do good. We might think that's one of the minor activities. We may not see it very often, but it's a fact that those who help the government out, they recognize that, they see that. So, in our lives, whether we like our rulers, whether we appreciate them, whether we agree with them or not, the alternative is far worse, and this is something that God recognized. And basically he's saying is the alternative to a structured government is you don't want it. You might think you do, but you really don't want it, and it's not going to work for you. Plus, since government is part of God's plan, then we need to accept it and work within it. He said, submit to the government. And it's pretty clear, pretty dry cut right there. Things we need to do. We need to submit ourselves. Now, we as Americans, probably compared to other countries, have a little more flexibility since our government officials are basically there because we put them there, or the majority of our fellow Americans put them there. And we have a say in things, who's there and who's not there. We have some influence, properly done, in trying to get them to do some things or to do other things. So our situation compared to what these Christians were under Roman rule was quite different. But the principles are still the same. And just because we can influence our leaders and express our opinions and whatnot, that doesn't give us a right to really be obnoxious, to be hateful, to speak poorly about them or anything of this sort. Those types of things, our freedoms don't give us a license to act that way or to think that way. So we need to be careful of that as well. So we don't want to be obnoxious. We don't want to, there's a proper way of doing everything. Even when we're disagreeing with someone, there's a proper way to do it. Also, freedom from the eternal consequences of sin carries with it certain responsibilities. We might have a good reputation in the eyes of the government and the eyes of the people around us, but we don't want to use that as a smokescreen for doing evil. We don't want to be in a situation where someone say, oh, surely he wouldn't do that, when actually they were. So we don't want to be a hypocrite. We don't want to look on the outside like we're really upstanding citizens, but behind the scenes we're cheating on our taxes or selling things we shouldn't be selling or things of this sort. We don't want to use what we look like to other people as a smokescreen. So as bondservants and as people obeying God, we want to be genuine. We want to be sincere all the time. And we want to be trustworthy in all things. Peter also talks about our attitudes toward other people, and that's a lot what these two books are about. And we've mentioned it before, our attitudes. How we think, what we think about each other, we think about ourselves, and whatnot. It's got so much to do on how we live our lives and how God sees us, and eventually how other people see us, because they can see through things that aren't real. So that's why Peter is saying here, as he concludes these few verses, he's saying, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. So again, some of these things is kind of maybe difficult. Honor all people. Well, some people just aren't very honorable, but still they are a creation of God. They are another person, another human being. And who knows, someone who today in our eyes looks terrible in what they're doing or what they're saying, tomorrow could be a brother. You know, think of Paul, how he changed so much. So we don't want to just brush people off or think that, well, they have no future in when it comes to God's kingdom goes, but it could be so very, very different. So we need to honor all people. We need to give respect because everybody was created by God. And Peter tells here for us to love the brotherhood. Again, this is not a secret. Paul wrote to the Galatians in chapter 6, let us do good to all, but especially to the household of faith. And I think this is only natural. There's just something natural about our attraction to family, earthly family or a Christian's family. So, part of that is, again, maybe just natural, but it's something we need to keep in mind. Because sometimes our Christian brothers may not be quite as friendly as other friends we have. Josh?
When I take verses 16 and 17 together, it kind of reminds me of Romans 14, where there are some things that we are free to do, it's okay to do. Eating a meat, for example, just from Romans 14. But if one of our brethren is offended by doing that activity or another, or whatever it is, even if I feel like it's not technically sinful for me to do this, I'm well within my right to do it. Knowing that your brother is offended by whatever that action is, it's like you're missing the point of Christianity. You need to think about your brother. You need to think about how you're viewed. Even when we look back at the comments about the government, verse 15, it talks about, it's the will of God that well-doing will put, silence the ignorance of foolish men, that you can take away these arguments by just maybe putting yourself second. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Putting others above yourself, considering your brethren's needs or people in your community. And that is that honor, I think, that could possibly be talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's difficult sometimes putting other people before us, but again, it's a matter of attitude. What I am about to say or about to do, how will it affect others? And a lot of times we don't know. But once we find out, then we want to be careful so that we don't just kind of propagate that bad feeling. We need to consider others. And Christ, he didn't put himself first, even though he certainly had the right to. He put others first. And he is our example. Also in this last phrase of these group of verses says, fear God. To these Jewish Christians, of course, that's nothing new. They remembered Ecclesiastes, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. So it's probably a reminder of those types of instructions. And honor the king. Again, this is, the king is part of all men, a special situation, a special office. But we don't want to be talking amongst ourselves. We can talk negatively about somebody when it comes to things they're doing, such as making laws or enforcing laws, but we don't want to carry it to the point where we're talking negatively about their character or something, or they don't, calling them something or think of them as something. We just need to be careful about those things. So that's part of this manual, so to speak, this chapter on our relationship to the government. We're about to turn the page and go to another chapter on our relationship to masters. But any other thoughts on the government side or anything else for that matter? Okay. Some more instructions Peter has. starting in verse 18. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this is commendable, if because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who when he was reviled did not revile in return, when he suffered he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. So another relationship we have to people is to our masters. Now, when Peter was writing this, the master-servant relationship, they were not strangers to this. They can just think of their Jewish history. Many of the Jewish people had servants. They were under bondage as a nation in Egypt. Joseph was sold into slavery, and it was commonplace to put themselves, if they couldn't pay a debt, they put themselves under bondage until they could pay that debt off. That was how they did it. And in the pagan world that surrounded them, slavery was something that was quite common. You can remember when the Jews were carried away by the Babylonians in several waves away from Jerusalem. They weren't, just come up and live with us. It's, they were drug off as slaves. Now the Babylonians were smart. They used the more intelligent people, like Daniel and his friends, to help make their civilization better. So that they did use them in those extents, but still they were essentially slaves or servants. So we might think that, well, that's foreign to us. We really aren't in submission to anybody, but we'd only be kidding ourselves if that's how we thought. I mean, who do we have to serve? Who has a big impact on our everyday lives? Of course, we think of the government. If we go to work, we have a boss that expects certain things from us at certain times and done in certain ways. We were all children once, but in that whole relationship, parent-child, there is instructions. There are things that the children are expected to do, and they suffer the consequences if they don't. If you've ever been on an athletic team, well, pretty well obeyed what the coach said. Otherwise, you won't be on the team very long. So if he said, do wind sprints or anything, well, you did them. If you're in the military, you had people telling you pretty much what to do and how to do it. So this isn't a strange relationship. So even though we may not have that servant relationship that were so common in this time, it still relates to us. So we aren't wasting our time talking about it. But again, being submissive to our masters is about attitude. We can have a real poor attitude about it and just make ourselves even more miserable than maybe the situation we're in. Or we can make it as pleasant as it could possibly be, all because of our attitude. And that's what Peter's saying here. We need to submit to our masters. We need to be obedient, number one. But also, we don't want to be hateful either in their presence or out of their presence. We don't want to be talking behind their back and to others and really putting them down, because sometimes that can have some pretty bad consequences. Plus, we don't want to sabotage or undermine someone's authority. If they give us some instructions to do, we don't want to do something that's going to make it where they fail and they look bad and we're thinking we're getting some kind of vengeance out of it, where actually we're probably hurting ourselves. I had one one job once where I got transferred to an area that they basically, the position I was put in, the job I had to do, they didn't think it was necessary for someone from the outside coming in to do it. They thought they were doing it just fine. And so there were times when they intentionally would do something to make it look bad. And it was pretty obvious, and my boss, or actually the boss of them who was located somewhere else, knew what was going on. So it was just a matter of outlasting their efforts. And eventually it turned around, it turned out great. But at first it was pretty miserable. And we don't want to be that way, where we're sabotaging other activities or other people just because we don't agree with them or of some relationship. That's a miserable thing as well. It talks about the characteristics of our masters, whether they're good or bad. That shouldn't dictate how our opinions of them, how we react to them, whether we do what they say or don't. That really doesn't have a role in this whole relationship. And we can have good masters, again, thinking of coaches or bosses or the government. And we can have those that are gentle or those that are harsh. But we need to view them, we need to react to them in the same way. And oftentimes that's not an easy thing to do. If someone's nice to us, it's not hard being nice back to them. But if someone's being hateful or harsh, unfair, at least in our opinion, it's much more difficult being nice back to them and being cooperative. But that is what God is asking us to do. So God is asking us or telling us to patiently endure sufferings regardless of if we consider it to be fair or not. And he's saying here that it's not especially commendable for someone who's being punished for something they did wrong, if they endured it patiently. So if you do something you know is wrong, it says, and you get punished for it, it says, what do you expect? You knew it was coming. You know you shouldn't have done it. And if you suffer through whatever the punishment is quietly, well, that's good, but not especially commendable. But rather, if you do something good and are punished for it for whatever reason, and you suffer for it quietly, if you endure it without being hateful and spiteful and trying to get back, revengeful, then that's something that God recognizes, for that is being Christ-like. For he had no call at all for suffering the things that he did. And especially if people knew why he was doing it at the time, they'd say, oh man. And they realized that afterwards, what have we done? So with Christ being our model of suffering things that just aren't right, we need to do it, take it as best we can, using Christ as our model. And Jesus taught this in what we call the Beatitudes in Matthew 5:10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus is our example. And of course, we are called to be like him. And we know that Jesus is far more than just a simple example, a simple model for us to live after. For not only did he have these characteristics and show these things, but he bore our sins and died on the cross for them. So he went far beyond anything God is asking us to do. And we always need to keep that in mind. Any thoughts about our relationship to who are effectively our masters, people telling us what the things that we need to do and how to do them? Okay, we'll continue on in our guidebook here when it comes to how to live our lives, and that's our relationship between husband and wives. This past Wednesday night we had a great lesson by Brother Ray Brantley, concerning stewardship, and this is dealing with our vocation, and it was a discussion on a relationship of husband and wives. And Peter's addressing this now. But I thought maybe as a little bit different way of introducing the subject, maybe helping us understand it a little better, if we back up a little bit and think about when God created the earth. He created Adam and put him out there and all the animals, and he named them and all this. And God realized that, well, Adam needs a companion as well, someone to help him, someone to be with him. All the animals are paired up. It says, why should it be any different with Adam? So we know that Adam was put to sleep, and a woman, or Eve, was created out of Adam. So now they also have a pair. And they had responsibilities in the garden. They were to tend it. Exactly what they were to do, we don't really know. But just thinking about it, I imagine that whole environment was pretty nice. Yeah, God had expectations from you. But when it comes to tending the garden, it wasn't a terrible chore. It wasn't all that difficult. But for whatever reason, they got restless. Basically, Satan fooled them into sinning, told them a story that wasn't true, and they believed it, and they sinned, and they were expelled from the garden. And now their life was totally different. They had to work for their living. Of course, work wasn't totally foreign to them. But it's a different situations. There's briars and thorns and weeds, and everything you do isn't going to necessarily work out. It's going to be hot. It's going to be difficult. And so leaving an environment where everything was great, and everyone, things were working out and they're getting along, to an environment where just living was a hassle. Well, it seems like that is a breeding ground for conflict between people, husband and wife. It's just much more difficult when you got all these other things going on and life is uncomfortable and difficult to get along than it would be when everything's just going great. So I think quite possibly some of these conflicts between married couples were at least in part caused by the environment that it was their own fault for getting them in that situation. Of course, we know that shortly after, we don't know, but people's lifespans were many, many years back then, how long it took for Cain and Abel to come along and for that murder to take place, and then Seth was born. But on a relative sense, family problems cropped up relatively quickly. So it's necessary, because of living in this world, and again, the conditions under which these Christians were living in the area of modern-day Turkey back then, life was tough. And when life is tough, oftentimes our family relationships can be pretty tough as well, or there's a higher probability of that happening. So here, Peter's going to give some guidelines for how they can survive some of these situations they're put in. So if we look at, so Peter's going to come up with some solutions. So in general, it's a matter of trying to maintain our relationship to God and our relationship to other people while living in this world. So it's, even if in our marriages things are going well, sooner or later things are going to crop up where we're really going to have to deal with that situation and come up with a solution for it one way or another. And God wants us to maintain the proper relationship to Him and to our spouses and to other people. So it's an important activity. Now, once in a while, we have something come up where we need to make a decision where all the options are either equally good or equally bad. And we might could get by with just flipping a coin or eeny, meeny, miny, mo, or something of that sort, because there's no clear good choice in either directions. But most of the times it doesn't happen that way. But when there are real disagreements in our families, when we've got decisions we really need to make, Basically, Peter's coming down to say, again, it's all a matter of attitude. How you're approaching the problem, how you consider your spouse, how much you love them and respect them, in coming up with this decision. And we need to, if we have certain things in our mind that we're kind of at an impasse here. We've got to make a decision. It's going to be a difficult one, and maybe all the alternatives are bad. But we want our marriage to work. The partners need to respect one another. They need to love one another. They need to be willing to sacrifice over time. So when it comes to making these decisions, it isn't always easy. So Peter knows that, and he's getting down to specifics. First, he addresses the wives. So if you look at 1 Peter chapter 3, the first 2 verses. Wives, likewise be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they, without a word, may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. So what Peter is saying here is, we don't know if these people ever read any of the other epistles that were being circulated at times, but Paul made the same admonitions in Ephesians chapter 5, wives, submit to your own husbands. Those words were repeated in the letter to the church at Colossae, and a letter to Titus, obedient to own husbands. So this isn't something, it may be new to these people, but it isn't new to the whole realm of God's teaching in New Testament times. There were some societies, including Judaism, where the stage was set for conflict when two people got married, because a lot of times they were arranged marriages. And you can think of, again, I don't know how well it illustrated the true Jewish culture, but in that play, Fiddler on the Roof, they had a lady whose role was the matchmaker, and she would run around the small town, and he would be a good mate for her, and it was an arranged marriage. Politically, we know that a lot of times marriages were arranged to try to promote the economies of both of them, or try to have peace, something of this sort. But we can just think, if someone arranged who we married, well, right away, well, I don't know anything about that person, or if I do, it may or may not be true. I don't know if we'll get along. All these kinds of things. So right away, you've got an awful lot to learn about one another. A lot of discovery, and a lot of things you discover may not be what you're hoping for. But for the most part, at least in our culture, that's not the case. We choose our spouses over time. Oftentimes, we not make the greatest of choices, but over time also we learn to love one another, and that's something that grows with time. So it's just part of the way we are. Also, Peter says here that wives likewise, he's been discussing being submissive to the government, being submissive to masters. He's saying likewise, or in a similar fashion, along the same vein, be submissive to your own husband. And he's not picking on wives at this time. He's not putting a exceptionally hard burden on them, saying, well, this is what they should do, and other people or husbands get off scot-free. It's all a matter of how are you handling these conflicts that eventually are going to come up. How are you going to approach it? Are you going to just fuss and argue about it? Are you going to go on strike? You got to boycott? Well, I'm not doing something because we got this argument going on. Anything that's going to make the marital relationship worse, that's not going to help things. That's not an approach to be made. So Peter, once again, is just saying that you need to cultivate the right attitude in times like this. There can be a lot of tension, things going on, but you need to have the right attitude. And speaking to wives, you need to respect and have patience with your husbands. You need to maintain your faithfulness and obedience to God. And even if your husband is asking you to do something that's against what God is teaching, don't do it. Hold your ground in those situations. But very possibly, over the long run, by doing that, he's going to eventually see through it and see the beauty of obeying God. So hopefully, your efforts and your faithfulness in obedience to God will win over an unfaithful or unconverted husband. But even if it doesn't, you're still being faithful to God. And some things that aren't necessarily all that easy, we can probably know some relationships there. People are in some pretty tough situations in their marriages. But the husbands aren't off the hook either. Now, he has words for them as well. Chapter 3 and verse 7, husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. What Peter's saying, this married relationship, it's a partnership. You both got roles, you both got responsibilities. Your intention, your desire is for you to be a great marriage, to either get the other partner saved if they aren't, or to keep them saved. And to do this, you're going to have to work together. You're going to have to share, you're going to have to sacrifice, and honor one another just like as you are to honor all people. Now, as the instructions were to the elders not to lord yourself over people, husbands aren't to lord themselves. Think of them as king and just giving flying commandments or instructions off left and right. That's not the situation. Also mentions wives as the weaker vessel. And I think we're talking here from a physical standpoint. For the most part, not 100% of the time, but for the most part, that's true. You go on a golf course, you've got ladies' tee and then men's tees and then maybe pros' tees as well. Today, there's a big conflict about men who claim to be the persuasion of women playing on women's teams. And you can see, well, that's not fair, because just the way, for the most part, we as humans are built. Men are bigger and stronger than women. When they're competing physically, it just doesn't work out and isn't fair. But it's not saying that wives are weaker from a spiritual standpoint, intellectual standpoint, emotionally or spiritually. For sure, that's not the case. We know of many cases, personally and in Scripture, where the wife was the better of the two, where the wife was the stronger of the two. Of course, this goes in the other direction too, where the wife was more evil. Think of Ahab and Jezebel, or even Herodias in her request to have John the Baptist's head on a platter. So sometimes the wives can be worse and more evil than the husbands, and can dominate in that fashion. So they aren't. So when it comes to the weaker vessel, that's really not what it's talking about. But even in Sarah, she's pretty forthcoming when it comes to trying to get the family started quicker with Hagar. And then when it didn't work out, it was her suggestion, said, she needs to be gone. Josh, did you?
Yeah, I agree with you. Give honor as unto the weaker vessel. I view it almost like how you handle a fine china. You're very careful with it because it's precious, right? And because maybe you are physically superior, you try to force it into something, you're going to break or crack it. But treat your wife with honor like something that is precious. You don't want to mishandle it.
Yeah, absolutely. You're thinking about what you're doing and the consequences of, like you say, if you pick up too much of the fine china, or you put it on something that's unstable, it's going to fall and break. You're thinking about what you're doing, and absolutely right. So The second bell is going to be ringing here shortly. But there's a reason to honor and respect, for husbands to honor and respect their wives. And again, it reiterates this partnership we have where we're working together, trying to help each other become a child of God and to stay that way. We'll kind of maybe finish that up next week, that thought, and go on from here. So thanks a lot for everyone. Thanks for your comments, and looking forward to worshiping together.